Hello learners, and welcome to this educational series where we take you through the paces in ELA, in this case, writing. My name is Miss Pilgrim, and today it's all about creative writing, specifically distinguishing reports from stories, author's purpose. Let's get started. We hope to explore the idea of author's purpose, and we hope to differentiate between stories and reports. Let's talk a little bit about author's purpose. Now, a purpose is a reason for doing something. So when an author sits down to write something, he or she has a reason to do so, especially if we're writing for an audience, for a reader. And so, if we want to think about the purposes of writing, we can think about PI. 3 purposes for writing. The P in PI stands for persuade, which means to convince somebody about something. An example of persuasive writing is maybe an advertisement where somebody's trying to convince you to buy something. The I in PI stands for inform, which means to teach someone or to share information. Most likely you'll find this type of writing in a textbook and, of course, in your reports. The E in PI stands for entertain, and that means to provide amusement or enjoyment to your reader. So these are the 3 types of writing that authors use, and you need to think about author's purpose very carefully, because your purpose will determine not only what you write, but how you write. So when you are writing for SEA, you're mainly focusing on 2 types. 1, writing to inform, in this case, reports, and writing to entertain, in this case, stories. And just as how builders use different tools to construct different types of buildings, writers have other tools that they can use to construct their writing. And these are some of the tools that writers use to write their stories or their reports. The parts of speech, very, very important tools. Your nouns, your adjectives, your verbs, and so on. Those are important tools to construct your writing. Figures of speech as well, very, very important tools, especially in poems and stories when you want to entertain someone with your similes and your metaphors and your personification and so forth. Punctuation is important because it tells the reader how to speak, how to raise their voice for a question, how to shout for an exclamation, and so on. A writer can also use specific sentence structures, like your simple sentences, your compound sentences, and your complex sentences. And if you're writing a report, you will need factual language. That's very important for factual reports. So we're going to read a couple of selections, and I want you to think very carefully about the writer's purpose, the writer's reason for writing that piece. How were you able to determine the purpose of these 2 pieces of writing? Let's look at the first one. What is a beach? A beach is made of very small or loose rock, sand, that gathers at the shore of a body of water. Beaches are created by waves or currents. The sand comes from erosion of rocks, both far away from and near the water. Coral reefs are a major source of sand. That's our first piece. Let's look at the other piece. This piece is called Shark Attack. The midday sun shined its heated rays on the turquoise water of the beach, causing them to sparkle like diamonds. The beach was packed with people of all shapes and sizes. Little children screamed with glee as they scampered like crazy ants under the watchful eyes of their parents. The green palm trees danced to the distant music of Kessa's latest hit. Meanwhile, the wicked hot sand singed the feet of the brave souls who dared to walk without slippers. Suddenly, this perfect scene was shattered by a scream that came from north of the lifeguard's booth. Shark! Shark! What do these pieces have in common? Well, one thing you might say is that they both have some sort of beach, but because the purpose is different, the language is different, right? So let's look at it side by side. Here we have the first, and here we have the second. So what's the first difference? Well, the most obvious thing is that the first one is shorter. What else can we talk about for this first piece? Did you notice that there were a lot of facts in this piece? And if you remember our lesson on internal text structure, this looks like what type of internal text structure? If you said description, that's very right, because the description internal text structure deals with the attributes or the characteristics of something. So we're learning information about the beach. We're learning about how it's made. We're learning about how sand is made. We're learning about how coral reefs are made. Very, very factual. Now, let's look at the other piece, which is much longer. Why do you think this piece is so much longer than the first? Well, maybe because the purpose is different. In the first piece, we might think that the writer wants to inform. In the second piece, there's a lot more description, so maybe the writer wants to entertain. Let's look at it. In this second piece, there are at least 11 adjectives. Take a quick look and see if you can find them. I'm going to give you 10 seconds. Time's up. Could you find them? So we have all kinds of adjectives describing nouns in this piece. Words like heated and turquoise and crazy and watchful and green and distant and wicked, hot, brave, perfect. Did you also notice that there are some figures of speech in this piece? At least 2 similes and some examples of personification. 5 more seconds. Let's see if you can find them. And here they are. We have 2 similes. Sparkle like diamonds. So the waters are being compared to diamonds. Like crazy ants. The children who are running about the beach are being compared to ants. What about the personification? The green palm trees dance to the distant music of Cass's latest hit. We know that that's personification because the palm trees are given the human quality of dancing. What about the wicked sun? That's given the human quality, well, we shouldn't say it's a human quality, but of being wicked. So, which one is being used to inform? And which one is being used to entertain? Of course, the first piece is informative, and the second one is meant to entertain. It's very, very important that we take the time when we were entertaining someone to really give those details. We're going to talk about a lot more of that in an upcoming lesson. So what's the big picture of this lesson? The author's purpose is very important. The reason you're writing is very important because it determines what you're going to write, whether it is a report or a story or a poem. It also determines how you're going to write, the language that you're going to use, whether you're going to use formal language, informal language, figurative language, or factual language. It's also important to remember that whether you're writing a story or a report, grammar is important because it helps you to structure your ideas in a proper way. And punctuation is also important because it helps your reader to understand how to read your piece. We're going to be talking a lot more about this in an upcoming lesson. You stay tuned. Welcome back, learners, and we're back again talking about writing, specifically distinguishing reports from stories. And we're going to focus a little bit more deeply right now into the characteristics of stories and reports. Now, you remember that when you're writing for SCA, you're going to actually either write a report or a story. And in the previous segment, we talked about author's purpose and that the purpose determines what you write and how you write. So if you are writing to inform, when you are writing your report, it's for a very, very serious purpose. How SpongeBob is being very, very serious. However, if you're writing to entertain, you want to get your reader really involved by giving lots of description and lots of interesting details that a report may not have. So we have to think about this very carefully because sometimes our readers need that kind of cue, right? And sometimes our writers don't do that. Sometimes they write stories that look like reports and reports that look like stories. Remember the big picture, that your purpose determines your form and your purpose determines your language, and that your grammar helps your reader to understand because the structure is there, and your punctuation helps your reader to read what you are writing. And again, remember the tools. Writing to inform has specific tools, and writing to inform has specific tools as well. So we're getting deeper now into stories and reports. Two different types of writing. We need to be very careful when we're writing them. Let's look very, very, very carefully at the characteristics of a report and the characteristics of a story. First of all, the purpose of a report is to inform, to teach somebody something. And the purpose of a story, of a narrative, is to entertain. The content of a report is very, very factual. Who, what, where, when. Not much else. A story has different content. We have elements, we have characters, we have setting, we have plot. In the structure of a report, it's very, very logical. There must be an introduction, there must be body, and there must be a conclusion. You can't start with the conclusion in a report. You can't start with the middle. It must be very logical because we are informing. We don't want our readers to be confused. In a story, however, we have a different structure. We have exposition, we have rising action, we have climax, we have resolution. The thing about a story, though, unlike a report, a story can actually start at the end. That's called the flashback technique, where you start at the end and work your way back to the beginning. You can't do that in a report because a report is supposed to be very, very logically sequenced from beginning to end. Let's look at the language. In a report, because you want to inform, the language has to be very, very formal and factual. So we don't want contractions. We do not want any slang. We do not want any use of Creole in a report because it's very, very, very formal. In a report, you have to use transitional words that ensure logical flow. So in a report, you would see transitional words like first and next, things like that. The vocabulary in a report has to be also very, very, very formal because we are informing. So we're not using words like beautiful and lovely because those are subject to opinion. In a report, you can use indirect speech. Let's look at the language of a story. In a story, because we want to entertain our reader, the language is descriptive, it's figurative, it's appealing to the senses. You want your reader to feel as if they are right there with you as you're writing. The transitions in a story are a bit different because they're ensuring flow and interest. So in a story, you might see the transitional word suddenly because that indicates an exciting change. You can't have the word suddenly in a report. We don't want any exciting changes in a report. We don't want anything exciting in a report because a report is meant to inform. The vocabulary in a story has to be very, very interesting because it's appealing to the senses. You want the vocabulary to make us see and touch and taste and feel what you're writing about. And in a story, we use direct speech. We try to avoid direct speech in reports, but in narrative writing, you want direct speech. You want the actual words that the characters are saying in this story. But in a story and in a report, remember what they have in common. Make sure that your spelling is on point, make sure your grammar is on point, and make sure that your mechanics and your paragraphing, make sure all of this is on point. So let's see how these operate in two pieces of writing. And these pieces of writing will feature the same characters. I want to introduce them to you. The first character is one of my favorites. His name is Calvin from the comic strip Calvin and Hobbes. Have you ever heard about Calvin and Hobbes? Calvin is, I think he's about 6 years old. He has a pet tiger, an imaginary friend, and they roam around and have all kinds of adventures. And one thing about Calvin is that he does not like school very much. This is Calvin's long-suffering mother. If you look at the strip there, he's saying, as he does every day, "I'm not going to school anymore." And of course, she's looking at him, really, oh, okay. This is Calvin's mom. And this is Susie. Susie is Calvin's neighbor. She's always trying to be his friend, but he's not always very nice to her. We are going to read about these characters in two versions of things that happened at a bus stop. I'm going to read the first one, Incident at the Bus Stop, version 1. On Monday, the 23rd of March, 2020, at approximately 7:45 a.m., an incident occurred at the bus stop at Farley Street, Port of Spain. The persons involved were Calvin Hobbes and his mother, Darlene Hobbes. At 7:30 a.m., Mrs. Hobbes was accompanying Calvin to the bus stop. During that time, Calvin repeatedly expressed his lack of desire to go to school that day. While making these statements, Calvin held a blanket and threw household items into the street. After approximately 5 minutes, Mrs. Hobbes asked Calvin to stand still or he would be sorry. Calvin ceased all movement and remained standing with his mother at the bus stop until the school bus arrived at 7:45 a.m. When Calvin saw the bus pulling up to the bus stop, he ran in the opposite direction. Mrs. Hobbes followed Calvin, caught him, and ensured that he entered the bus and took a seat. As the bus was pulling away from the curb, Calvin could be heard repeatedly asking his mother to take him home. However, Mrs. Hobbes did not respond to his requests. Calvin remained seated in the bus until it arrived at Riverdale Primary School at 8:30 a.m. without any further incident. So this is our first version of what happened. Let's look at it very carefully. This is an example of a report, and so it has the clear structure of introduction, body, and conclusion. Very, very logically sequenced. What else do we notice about this piece? Well, there are a lot of factual details in this piece. Very, very, very clearly said. No ambiguity at all. We notice that the transitional words are very, very logical. We're using the sequence instructional text structure. So we're seeing on, and time, and during, and while, and when, and so on. Very logically and clearly organized. Now, let's look at version 2. What a gorgeous day, Susie declared as she strolled towards the bus stop. The gentle morning wind lightly tossed her pixie-cut hair as she glanced at her watch. It was 7:30 a.m. She had just enough time to read a chapter of her novel. Soon, she was lost in her hero's adventures. Suddenly, ear-piercing screams shattered the early morning tranquility. I don't want to go to school. You can't make me. Ah! Help! Susie's eyes widened like two saucers and waited for the epic battle to begin. Soon, two figures came into view. Mrs. Hobbs, wearing her fuzzy red bathrobe and brown bedroom slippers, was trying to grasp her tiny, wriggling son, Calvin. Calvin's blonde hair pointed in all directions. He was gripping his blanket and screaming louder than 10 fire engine sirens. Calvin, you know you have to go to school. Mrs. Hobbs' voice was strained from all her exertion. Then, as if gathering superhuman powers, she held Calvin's shoulders and growled, you stand right here or you will be sorry. Coming to his senses, Calvin finally stood still. Susie's eyes moved from scowling mother to pouting son. How long would this peace last? The familiar revving of the big yellow school bus answered her question. Yes, Mrs. Hobbs joyfully declared. No, Calvin screamed as he jumped like a deranged kangaroo and scampered into the opposite direction. Susie's saucer eyes became full moons as Mrs. Hobbs sprinted after her escaping son. Her heart skipped a beat at this spectacle. This was better than her novel. With superhuman speed, Mrs. Hobbs galloped after Calvin, caught him, and marched him towards the open bus door. Have a good day at school, son, she said sweetly as she shoved him into the bus and breathed a sigh of relief. Susie silently followed Calvin as he resumed his morning tantrum. She shook her head. You would have sworn that he was being sent into a den of lions and not to the same school he had been attending for 5 years. When they settled into their seats, Susie turned to her grumpy neighbor and said, did you know that nobody on our street sets an alarm clock in the morning? Oh, hush, Calvin grumbled. Susie shrugged and stared out the window. As the bus slowly pulled away from the curb, she wondered what acts of torture he was plotting for Miss Wormwood today. Did you enjoy that story? Think about the two pieces of writing that you just listened to, version 1 and version 2. Put on your thinking caps and think about how they were similar and how they were different. Take 5 seconds and think about it a little bit. How were they similar and how were they different? Okay, so let's look at it. In version 1, version 1 and version 2 were both accounts of what happened at a bus stop. That's similar. And they both had paragraphs. That's similar as well. What were the differences? In version 1, it was a report. Susie may have been asked by her teacher to write about what happened at the bus stop, and she had to be very, very factual and logical. So she was informing. In version 2, the purpose was to entertain, and so of course it was very different. We had a who, what, where, when in this version, in version 1 of this incident at the bus stop. What happened? Calvin had a little scrimmage. Where did it happen? At the bus stop. When and where? All of those were explored in version 1. But in version 2, we got a lot more information about the characters and the setting and, of course, the plot. In version 1, very logically sequenced. In version 2, we had all the elements of plot, all of the elements right there, the exposition, rising action, and so on. The language of the first version was very factual, very to the point, very succinct. There were no figures of speech used at all. But of course, in this story, very, very imaginative, lots of figures of speech and adjectives, because, as we said before, the purpose of version 1 was to inform, and the purpose of version 2 was to entertain, even though both of them dealt with an incident at the bus stop. So we're going to look at the introduction of both of these pieces of writing. The first piece is the introduction in the report. And we know that a report has specific things that must go in the introduction. You must have your date. You must have the time. You must have specifically what happened, whether it is an incident or an accident or whatever it is. There must be a location, specific address of the location, and the persons involved. In the exposition, because an introduction in a story, we call it the exposition, where you introduce your setting and you introduce your characters. In the exposition, we notice that there is a lot of description of the setting. We hear about the beautiful wind, and it was a gorgeous day. Susie uses direct speech, which we like to use in stories. Susie is described, her pixie cut hair, their actions. And I'll make a point here that when you want to describe your characters in your stories, in order to get your full 20 marks, you want to have physical description, you want to have action, and you want to have dialogue. And in this exposition, there is a good example of how these three are used. So we're going to continue with the rest of the report and the rest of the story. Look at the difference. Immediately, we notice that the story much longer, the report much shorter. And this is because the writer takes time to give us more information, because if the purpose is to entertain, and if you want your reader to feel as if you're right there, then you have to use a lot of adjectives to make them feel that they're there, make them hear and see and experience what you're writing about. So let's look at the story. And let's look at how the writer took the time to use a lot of adjectives and figures of speech to make the reader feel as if he or she is right there in the story. Look at the adjectives: the ear-piercing screams, the epic battle. Can you picture Mrs. Hobbs in her fuzzy red bathrobe and her brown bedroom slippers? Using colors are very important when you're describing things in stories. Can you picture Calvin and his blonde hair? Can you picture how little he is and how he's moving about, how he's wriggling? There's even an appeal to the sense of hearing. He's screaming louder than 10 fire engine sirens. So the writer in the second piece, in the story, takes the time. And when you're writing stories, you need to take the time to use your figures of speech and use your adjectives to make your reader feel as if they're right there, as opposed to the report where your reader just needs the information. Doesn't want a whole lot of fluff. The reader just needs just the facts. That's very important. Let's compare. Again, continue with the body. Look at how this was expressed. In the report version, after approximately 5 minutes, Mrs. Hobbs asked Calvin to stand still or he would be sorry. That's good for a report. We don't want much direct speech. We don't want to make the report sound too much like a narrative. But look at how that same thing is expressed in the story. Calvin, you know you have to go to school. You stand right there or you'll be sorry. Isn't that much more dramatic than the first version? So in the first version, we want to inform. We don't want drama, but please put all the drama in your story. Again, look at the notice the difference in length. Much more time is spent on a story adding adjectives, adding details. Again, the report, short, succinct, to the point, logical, because the purpose is to inform. We don't want any extra stuff. The reader does not have time to read extra stuff in a report. What we want is in the story, the reader has the time because the reader has chosen to take your story and read it. And so we have the adjectives, we have the direct speech, we have the figures of speech. Moving on to the last version, the conclusion. Look at the conclusion of the report. Again, the difference, short, succinct, to the point. In the story, we had to add all the details, all the opinions. Susie thought about Calvin, about why he was getting on like that. She was wondering to herself, why was he behaving like this? Calvin was being very impolite when he told her, oh, hush. We can't put that in a report. Those things are not necessary. So, to sum up, 3 main differences between a report and a story. They have different purposes. The report is meant to inform. The story is meant to entertain. They have different content. The report has facts, logical transitional words and phrases. The story has figurative language, lots of adjectives, things that will make the reader feel as if he or she is right there with them. And of course, the language is different. In the next segment, I'm going to be looking at a specific example of a report that kind of looks like a story. Stay tuned. Welcome back, learners. We're going a little bit deeper into our exploration of reports and stories. And we're going to be distinguishing reports and stories. We're looking at an example of a report that has a few story elements. We don't want that. Just a reminder that a report and a story, 2 different types of writing. One is meant to inform, and one is meant to entertain. Now, what happens when they get mixed up? When you have like a Rory or a Seaport, I guess. We need to be careful not to mix the 2 genres. And sometimes when I read students writing, I find stories that have elements of a report in it and reports that have elements of story. If you want to get your full 20 marks, you're going to avoid it. Now, I like eggs and I like peanut butter, but I don't like them together. We don't want to mix them. And in the same way, we don't want to mix stories and reports. We don't want to mix those elements at all, at all, at all. So let's look at an example of where elements of a story intrude this report. And I'm putting the report in inverted commas. This report is about a visit to the zoo. Let's read it together. One lovely day, I woke up and dressed for school. I was going on a field trip to the zoo. I ran outside fast as I could while telling Mommy and Daddy goodbye. When I reached the school, my friends told me to get ready, the bus was coming. I said okay. I went to the shop and bought water, juice, and food. Soon the bus arrived, and everyone entered the bus and sat. When we reached the zoo, I ran to see the lion, but the teacher told us not to touch. I asked my friend if he wanted to see the lions. He ran and saw a big one and a small one. Afterwards, we saw monkeys eating bananas and playing. Afterwards, we saw beautiful green and blue fishes. Finally, it was time to return to school. When I got home, I told my mother and father about it. Now, this student submitted this as a report, but does it have all the elements of a report? Let's look at it more carefully. So, first of all, whenever I look at a student's piece of writing, I like to look at what's positive, what actually is there. In this report, this student has used transitional words quite well. We have our sequence words. We have when, we have soon, we have then. So the writer is trying to sequence the ideas quite well, and that's good. Some details are present. They went to the zoo. They saw lions, and they saw fishes, they saw monkeys. So we have some details. But some details are missing on there. Let's talk about some details that are missing. And before we look at the details that are missing, a bit of a problem with this report, and there are some details that are unnecessary. Let's look at this paragraph, second paragraph, third paragraph, and fourth paragraph. And what are some unnecessary details? Okay, let's look. In a report, we don't want our reader to know about whether it was a lovely day or a fabulous day. That's not necessary in a report. We also don't need the detail about him running outside to tell his mommy and daddy goodbye. That's not necessary for the report. Let's look at the second paragraph. If we're writing about a field trip to the zoo, we don't really want to know about what his friends told him, what he bought at the shop, because he hasn't even reached the zoo. So that's not important either. Okay, we have some details that are good. We have what he did at the zoo. Maybe we may need some more details. And at the bottom there, we don't need to know what he told his parents about it, because it's not necessary for the report. Let's talk about the details that were missing in this report. What was the report about? Well, it was clear it was about a visit to the zoo. Where did the visit take place? We know it was a zoo, but in a report you want to be specific. And so the writer needed to write the name of the zoo, and that was not given. When did the field trip take place? We don't know. No date was given and no time was given. Who went on the field trip? We're not sure. Was it a particular class? Was it a standard 5 class, standard 4 class, standard 3 class? We don't know. That detail was not given. What was seen during the field trip in order? Well, we have that detail. He said that they saw lions, they saw monkeys, and they saw fish. So that detail was there. And how did the trip end? It's not clear. What time they arrived back at school, if their parents picked them up at the end, we're not sure. So those details are missing. Let's examine the introduction of this report. What can we keep in this report? Based on what you know about report writing, and based on what you know about what an introduction must have, who, what, where, when, that is, who were involved, when it happened, where it happened, when it happened. Look at this introduction. Does it have any details that are needed for the introduction of a report? Very quickly, we can tell that no, it does not have the details that we need. There's no date. We don't know who went on the field trip. We know that there was a field trip. We don't know the name of the zoo. We don't know the address of the zoo. Okay, that's very important. So remember, we have to say this a lot, and we say it again, as in your introduction of a report, one paragraph summarizing who, what, where, when. Notice we did not say why, because in the introduction of a report, you do not need a reason, no why, just what happened, involving whom, where, and when. So, in a previous lesson, you learned about how to write the introduction of a report, and you explored a template for the introduction of a report on a visit to the zoo. So you can use this template to help you figure out and help the student to improve the writing. And so the student could have changed what he had before to this. On Friday, the 7th of February, 2020, the Standard 5 class of Central Primary School went on a field trip to the Emperor Valley Zoo. Zoo Road, Port of Spain. The students, accompanied by their teacher, Mr. Marvin Lee, left the school compound at 8:30 a.m. and returned from the field trip at 2:30 p.m. Much more clear than the introduction before. So please, don't mix them up. Don't put elements of a report. We don't want to talk about lovely days and happiness and what you told your mommy and didn't tell your mommy in a report. So we talked about the introduction of this visit to the zoo in a report. When the student is continuing this report, the student must continue by discussing in the body the different stalls visited at the zoo in logical order. And when the writer is concluding this report, take the time to talk about how the trip ended, the time they left the zoo and the time they returned to school. Just a quick summary of report writing. Remember, the report must be very logically ordered, and it can be divided into three main parts: your introduction, your body, and your conclusion. Remember that the introduction is just one paragraph summarizing who, what, where, and when. Your body, 2 or 3 paragraphs. You don't need much more than that. 2 or 3 paragraphs detailing what happened in chronological order using factual information. And finally, you can just write 1 paragraph giving a brief discussion of what happened at the end of the incident. In the next segment, we're going to examine another example where the writer mixed the genres a little bit too much. Stay tuned for that. Welcome back, learners, and we're exploring today distinguishing reports from stories. In the previous segment, we looked at an example of a report that had story elements. In this example, we're going to look at a story that kind of sounds like a report. Let's look at it. But before we do, of course, I always like to do a review. Remember that the report and the story have 2 different purposes. I know it sounds like a broken record, but believe me, when I look at students' work, sometimes they forget that a report is one kind of writing with one kind of purpose, and a story is another type with another type of purpose. And when they get mixed up, it's very difficult for your reader to understand. Now, let's look at this outfit. Would you rock this outfit? Would you go outside looking like this? I don't think so. Similarly, in a report and a story, you don't want to mix the elements. Don't confuse stories and reports and stories. Let's look at an example at a student who submitted a story. Let's read it. On Monday, 23rd March, I was returning home from school when I was distracted by my neighbor's dog. I was not paying attention and was not in a proper position to move. A car was coming towards me and I felt someone pick me up and throw me on the pavement. I got up and in pain looked at the person who saved me. It was my Uncle Paul. He was angry and worried at the same time. How did this happen? He asked. I was scared to tell him the truth because I thought I was going to be in trouble. Eventually, I told the truth and he forgave me. I decided that I would always pay more attention when walking on the street. Now, this student submitted this as a story. But does it sound like a story? If you think about the version we read earlier, it's very short, isn't it? Not many details, not emotional at all. Very factual, very to the point. It's a story, but it sounds like a report. So let's look at a checklist of what a story must have. If you're writing a story, make sure you have described time and place. That's what the setting is, right? So the reader can clearly picture it. make sure that you have developed characters through physical descriptions, action, and dialogue. To get your full marks, you must have all three. Make sure that your story has exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. You've been doing this and you know what all these things are. So when we look at the story that the student wrote and we apply the checklist, let's see if this student has all the elements in this story. So we see there's some exposition, which is the introduction of the story. He's coming from school, or she is coming from school. He got distracted. The rising action occurs, a car comes towards him, and we're not sure what the climax is. And then we go to falling action. He got up, he was afraid to tell his uncle. And then the resolution of the story is he told the truth and he was forgiven. Very short. First thing we want to look at, and I see some students do this a lot, if you're writing a story, never, ever, 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 and one more ever, never start your story with on Monday, the 23rd of March, or Tuesday, the 4th of April, or any date like that. Because immediately your reader will think that you are writing a report. And I see this a lot in some students' work, where they're writing a story, but begin it like a report. Don't want to do that. Ever, 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 and one more ever. Now, we're looking at the checklist, and let's see what this story, if it has the elements. So, has this student described the time and place so that the reader can clearly picture? Well, not really. Is there physical description? Is there action? Is there dialogue? Is there exposition, rising action, climax, and falling action? Let's see one by one. Has he described, or she, the writer, described the time and place? I don't even believe that there was any reference to the time or place in that story. Is there physical description? We don't know what Uncle Paul looks like. We don't know what the dog looks like. So no, there's no physical description. There is some action, but we would have liked a few more details. There is some dialogue, but I think some more dialogue may have helped the reader get insight into the narrator's feelings. There is exposition. The story starts with kind of time, but it starts like a report, so we don't want that. The rising action was very, very rushed. So there was no description of emotions. A car is coming towards him. He's not scared, or she is not scared. We don't know how he or she is feeling at all in this story. There's no dramatic events, so that's missing. There's no climax at all. No intense emotions, no heightened physical reactions, nothing intense at all in this story. There is some falling action, there's some resolution, and there is no descriptive language. I don't think there was one adjective in that entire story, nor was there a figure of speech. So we need to help the student fix this story. Don't worry. Actually, the story could be fixed. It's not as bad as we think it is. So let's look at how we can help the student improve this story. It's really, really important. And one of the problems this particular student had is that he or she ran with the story. It's important when you're writing a story to take your time. Take your time to write the story. Go very, very methodically to the setting, to the character, to the emotions, to the dialogue. Take your time with your story. So we're going to fix the exposition in this story. This student's exposition was, on Monday the 23rd of March, I was returning home from school when I was distracted by my neighbor's dog. Now, how can we fix this introduction, this exposition to the story to make it a bit more exciting? Because we want to entertain our reader. So let's ask some questions. What was the weather like? What was going on around you? How were you feeling? How did the dog get your attention? What kind of dog was it? What did it look like? So if we think about it, if I'm going to rewrite this exposition, I'm going to say that the weather is kind of hot. So I'm going to have to write about how it's hot and how the reader will know that the weather is hot. I think I'm going to make my setting too about a busy street. I'm going to have honking cars, and I'm going to have things that will show my reader that it's a busy street. How is the reader feeling? How is the character feeling? I think the reader will be tired from a long day of school. How is the dog going to get the attention of the reader? The dog, well, maybe the dog squeezed through the fence and ran towards him. I like huskies, so my dog is going to be a husky in the story. And what does it look like? It's going to look very cute like this, with beautiful blue eyes. So we're going to fix this exposition and make sure it improves. As we said, the first one is too bland. It's too short. We're going to make it longer because we are taking our time. Let's read it together. My scuffed sneakers scraped the uneven pavement as I stumbled tiredly home from school. The wicked sun drained my energy with every step. Through my weariness, I could vaguely hear the honking horns on the busy street. I didn't pay much attention to this because it was normal at this time of day. I continued to daydream about my soft bed waiting at home when I heard a yelp behind me. I jumped, turned around, and smiled. It was my neighbor's dog, Blue. Blue was everyone's favorite dog. He was gorgeous, a gorgeous white husky with the most piercing blue eyes I had ever seen. Blue had 2 speeds, top speed and dead asleep. Today was a top speed kind of day. Look at the difference between exposition 1 and exposition 2. Notice how adjectives make so much of a difference in this exposition. Look at the first exposition, so very short. But in the second exposition, we have more adjectives. They make such a difference in developing your story. Notice too how we took the time to discuss the hot afternoon, the honking horns, the tired student, the excited, beautiful husky with the blue eyes. Let's fix the rising action in this story. I was not paying attention and was not in a proper position to move. A car was coming towards me. That's all the student had for the rising action. But of course, as we've been saying throughout this entire presentation, a story needs to be developed. We need to take our time and use adjectives to make the reader feel as if he or she is right there. So let's ask some questions. How was he distracted? How did he become aware that a car was approaching? How did he feel? How did he react? So I'm thinking about it, and I think he will be distracted because he was busy petting the dog. And how did he become aware that a car was approaching? Maybe he heard a blaring horn. And of course, how would he feel? How would you feel if you were petting a dog and suddenly you're seeing a car approach you? So I think he's going to turn around and see the headlights. His heartbeat is going to accelerate. His eyes are going to widen. He's going to see his life flash before him. All kinds of things are going to happen when he sees this car approaching him. So let's look at the old rising action. I was not paying attention and was not in a proper position to move. A car was coming towards me, and let's build on that with a better rising action. I bent to pet Blue, and his pink tongue wiggled crazily. Soon we were jostling like 2 wrestlers in the street, not caring about our surroundings. All my tiredness had fled. Blue had that effect on me. Suddenly, a blaring horn interrupted our game. We jumped. What in the world was that? I turned around to see 2 headlights approaching me. Although it was daylight, the headlights looked like laser beams in the distance. All thoughts of play escaped as I tried to move, but fear glued me like cement to the spot. My life flashed before me. Since I had only been on Earth for 11 years, it didn't flash for long. I squeezed my eyes shut as the headlights got bigger and bigger. Now, isn't that a much more effective rising action climax than this one? What did we do again? We took our time and added details and described all the feelings, or the figures of speech, or the emotions for your story. Take your time. Don't rush the process. Let's look at it. Look at the adjectives. Look at the headlights, look like laser beams, a simile. Fear glued me. Figure of speech there, my life flashed before me. Take your time with your stories and look at all of the emotions and physical reactions. When you're writing a story and huge things are happening to you, take your time to describe the physical reactions, what's happening in your body. If you're scared, you're trembling, your throat is dry, your heart is beating fast. If you're angry, your face is red, you're feeling hot, heat in your face, all that kind of thing. You need to take the time to describe what's physically happening inside of you when you're describing emotions in a story. So what are the lessons that we have learned so far? We've learned to not confuse stories with reports. Very, very important. Let's try not to confuse them. And of course, don't confuse reports with stories and stories with reports. Pay attention to the structure. You know this. You've been studying this for a long time. Just pay attention. When you're writing a report, that's very, very specific. When you're writing a story, very, very, very specific as well. For the reports, you're going to focus on logical structure and sequencing. You're going to include facts only. You're going to maintain formal language. You're going to omit opinions and emotions. And for stories, because you want your reader to get really involved in what you're writing about, focus on appealing to your reader's senses. Take the time to describe your setting. Take the time to develop your characters. Use descriptive language to make your readers feel as if they are right there, and use your figures of speech. Thank you so much for joining us discussing distinguishing between reports and stories. I hope you enjoyed it. Happy writing.